Welcome to the Silent Empires, a place where power moves quietly, and every story carries a shadow. We don't interrupt your experience with ads, just pure, uninterrupted storytelling made for those who understand the silence behind the noise. If this story pulled you in, if you felt even a part of it, take a moment to like this video. And in the comments, tell me something simple but powerful. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I want to see how far this empire reaches, and who's awake with me in this moment. On a cold New York afternoon in the mid-1980s, cameras clustered at the steps of a federal courthouse, their lenses trained on a man the tabloids had started calling the Teflon Don. John Gotti, immaculately dressed and visibly enjoying the attention, moved through the crowd of reporters, as if walking a red carpet rather than entering a building where prosecutors hoped to put him away for the rest of his life. Shouts of questions filled the air, microphones lunged forward, and flashbulbs exploded in rapid succession. Most people watching the evening news that night would remember only that face, that smile, that swagger. What they would not see, what the cameras rarely bothered to capture, were the quieter figures who slipped in and out of frame, men who had spent years operating in the shadows, whose names were known mainly to detectives, prosecutors, and those living in the neighborhoods where power was enforced away from television lights. Among those figures, one name kept resurfacing in police reports and surveillance logs: Anthony "Tony" Rampino. He did not command headlines, and he was not the man jurors were sworn in to judge. But in the background of some of the most turbulent years in New York's struggle with organized crime, Rampino's presence was felt in social clubs and backrooms, on street corners, and in the confidential notes of federal agents who described him as a dangerous narcotics trafficker, an enforcer, and a man deeply enmeshed in the violent world of the Gambino crime family. To understand how a boy from a crowded New York tenement ended up orbiting one of the most notorious gangland figures of the 20th century, it is necessary to step away from the bright glare of the courthouse cameras and return to a city that was, in many ways, still rebuilding from war and depression, a city where the roots of his life story were quietly taking hold. Anthony Rampino was born in New York City in the late 1930s, into a working-class Italian-American family at a time when the city's immigrant neighborhoods were still tight-knit worlds of their own. Public records and later law enforcement accounts point to his early years being spent in Manhattan's East Harlem, one of the most densely populated Italian districts in the United States. Narrow streets, aging tenements, and overflowing stoops defined the landscape. Italian dialects mixed with English on the corners. The smell of cooking drifted from open windows in summer. Church bells marked the rhythm of the day. For families like the Rampinos, life revolved around hard work, extended kin, and the small, familiar geography of the neighborhood. East Harlem in those years occupied an uneasy space between poverty and aspiration. Many residents were only a generation removed from rural towns in southern Italy. They had come seeking stability and opportunity, and they found some measure of both, but at a price. Work was often grueling and insecure: jobs in factories, on construction sites, in warehouses, and on the docks. Rents were high for crowded apartments, and the social services that might have helped struggling families were limited. Young men growing up in that environment saw two parallel realities. On one side, fathers and uncles leaving before dawn and returning exhausted, pockets never quite full enough. On the other, a smaller group of men who seemed to defy the rules. Those men, the local representatives of what the press would come to call the Mafia and its Cosa Nostra structure, were not abstractions in East Harlem. They were the men outside the social club who always had cash, who looked well-dressed even in lean times, who could arrange a job as a favor or settle a dispute with a word. Their presence formed part of the background to Anthony's childhood. Even as a boy, he would have walked past the unmarked doors of clubs that served as informal headquarters for local crews. He would have seen the pecking order enforced not by uniforms or official titles, but by posture, tone, and who moved out of whose way on the sidewalk. The larger world of Italian-American organized crime was undergoing dramatic change in those years. The 1930s and 1940s had seen the consolidation of power under figures like Charles Lucky, Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia. By the time Anthony was old enough to notice the adult world around him, those names might have been murmured in newspapers and courtrooms more than on the street, but the system they had shaped was fully in place. The Five Families, the organizational backbone of the New York Mafia, controlled rackets ranging from gambling and loan sharking to union infiltration and construction contracts. For a boy growing up in an area where many residents shared the same ethnic background as the men at the top of that pyramid, the idea that our people held real power could be both a point of pride and a dangerous temptation. Anthony's upbringing, as far as surviving records indicate, was not dramatically different from many of his peers. His family lived modestly. There were likely strong expectations that he would find steady work, help support relatives, and respect the traditional authority of parents, priests, and community elders. But authority in neighborhoods like East Harlem was not just a matter of religion and family. The underworld exerted its own pull, and it did so through the most impressionable segment of the population. Young men who were old enough to see limits to their parents' sacrifices, but too young to have committed themselves to any particular path. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, juvenile gangs and street crews were a visible part of New York life, and East Harlem was no exception. Some of these groups were loose clusters of teenagers looking for belonging, quick money, and excitement, engaging in petty theft, fights, and low-level scams. Others were already loosely aligned with established organized crime figures, serving as informal lookouts, couriers, or muscle. Into this environment stepped a generation of youths whose choices would shape not only their own fates, but the law enforcement priorities of the coming decades. What little has been reliably documented about Rampino's adolescence suggests that, like many boys in his neighborhood, he did not remain on the straight path for long. By his late teens and early 20s, law enforcement files would later record his name in connection with minor offenses, the sort of street-level activity that rarely attracted headlines but steadily built a criminal record. Small-time thefts, suspected involvement in gambling operations, and associations with known offenders. To the youth who engaged in them, these might have seemed almost routine, a way to supplement income in a world where legitimate work offered few rewards. To police and prosecutors, however, they were early warning signs of a deeper slide. The 1950s were also years when the American government's relationship with organized crime began to harden. In 1957, the now famous Appalachian meeting in upstate New York, where dozens of mob figures from across the country were detained in a surprise police raid, forced law enforcement and the public to acknowledge that what had often been dismissed as scattered gangs was in fact a national network. Throughout the early 1960s, testimony from turncoats like Joseph Valachi before the United States Senate laid out, in stark detail, the existence and structure of Cosa Nostra. These hearings confirmed what many people in Anthony's neighborhood had always suspected, but they also signaled something new. The federal government was no longer willing to treat the mafia as a vague, localized issue. For young men on the periphery of that world, the risks of deeper involvement were increasing, even if the consequences were not yet fully visible. As the decade progressed, Anthony's environment began to shift geographically as well as politically. Italian-American populations that had long been concentrated in Manhattan neighborhoods like East Harlem and the Lower East Side were steadily moving outward into the boroughs. One of the areas that absorbed many of these families was Ozone Park in Queens, a community of tidy houses, small businesses, and by the 1960s, an increasingly visible mob presence. Law enforcement and journalistic accounts place Rampino in this world, gravitating toward the orbit of the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club on 101st Avenue, a social club that would later become synonymous with John Gotti's Queens crew. Ozone Park was, on the surface, a suburban step-up from East Harlem. Blocks of one- and two-family homes, front lawns, and quiet streets represented the kind of upward mobility many immigrant families craved. Yet the move from Manhattan's crowded tenements did not distance residents from organized crime. It simply relocated its base of operations. In fact, the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club and similar establishments embedded in these new neighborhoods made underworld power feel even closer. Behind the club's ordinary facade, decisions were made that affected bookmakers, loan shark debtors, and, eventually, drug networks stretching far beyond Queens. For someone like Rampino, the shift to Queens brought him into closer proximity with an emerging generation of Gambino associates who preferred action and personal loyalty over the more cautious, old-world style of earlier bosses. Among them was John Gotti, several years Anthony's senior, a man whose own rise from street hijacker and enforcer to feared crew leader was already underway by the late 1960s. Their paths intersected at a time when Gotti was assembling a circle of trusted associates and hangers on who were willing to do what was required to earn money and enforce his authority. Contemporary accounts by law enforcement and later informants describe Rampino as part of this loose circle. He was not a high-ranking member of the Gambino family. He would remain an associate, never formally initiated, but he was close enough to some of its most volatile and ambitious figures to be swept up in their conflicts, schemes, and eventually, in the harsh scrutiny of federal investigators. Even before headlines attached him to specific cases, his name appeared repeatedly in surveillance notes. Seen entering or leaving the Burgeon Club, observed in conversation with key Gotti associates, present at gatherings where business was being discussed behind closed doors. The social dynamics within these circles left their own imprint on Anthony's identity. Nicknames were a fixture of underworld culture, a way of marking in group status and personality traits. At some point during these years, he acquired the name by which he would be known in both street lore and official documents, Tony Roach. Accounts differ on how exactly the nickname arose. Some contemporaries suggested it referred to his gaunt, restless appearance, shaped in part by long-term drug use. Others thought it came from his ability to lurk in the background, overlooked by outsiders yet always somehow present, like the unwelcome insects evoked by the term. Whatever its origin, the nickname stuck, and with it a reputation that combined menace with a certain grim recognition of how far he had drifted from any conventional life. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, one of the most significant forces shaping Anthony's trajectory was the expanding heroin trade. New York, already a central hub for narcotics distribution, saw a sharp increase in the availability and potency of heroin during these years. The drug's impact cut brutally across neighborhoods, lives derailed, families fractured, crime rates rising as addiction drove desperate acts. Officially, many mafia bosses claimed they wanted nothing to do with narcotics, viewing them as too risky, too likely to attract government crackdowns. In practice, however, numerous crews and individual mob figures became deeply involved in heroin trafficking, seeing in it enormous profit potential. Law enforcement records and trial testimony from later years consistently identify Rampino as one of the underworld figures drawn into this dangerous trade. By his early adulthood, he was described as both a user and a distributor, someone who moved in circles where heroin was not just contraband but a daily reality. This dual role had a corrosive effect. Addiction undermined the discipline and self-preservation instincts that many organized crime figures prized, while participation in distribution tied him to a chain of suffering that extended far beyond his immediate surroundings. For investigators, his involvement in narcotics made him a priority target. For those living with addiction in New York's working-class neighborhoods, Men like him represented a proximate source of the substance that was unraveling their lives. The same city that had nurtured his early years was changing rapidly under this pressure. In East Harlem, where Rampino had spent his childhood, boarded-up buildings and rising crime testified to the damage wrought by economic dislocation and the influx of hard drugs. In Queens, the promise of a quieter, safer life came into conflict with the reality that powerful criminals now operated from garages and storefront clubs within walking distance of family homes. This tension, between the desire for stability and the presence of a hidden but potent criminal infrastructure, framed Anthony's daily existence as he settled deeper into the role of Gambino associate and street-level enforcer. Even at this stage, before the major cases and headlines that would later define his reputation, the pattern of his life was becoming clear to those who watched him closely. Police, state-organized crime task forces, and eventually federal agencies compiled notes and dossiers that painted a picture of a man shaped by the specific conditions of his time and place. Post-war immigrant New York, the rise and professionalization of the mafia, the outward migration to Queens, and the explosive emergence of the heroin economy. At each juncture, Anthony Rampino made choices that moved him one step further away from the ordinary life his parents might once have imagined for him, and one step closer to the violent, secretive world that would ultimately dictate the course of his adult years. By the early 1970s, those choices had placed him firmly within the orbit of John Gotti's crew, men whose own ambitions would soon erupt into open confrontation with rival factions, and in time, with the full weight of federal law enforcement. Standing in that shadow, Anthony "Tony" Roach Rampino was no longer just a boy from East Harlem. He was a known quantity in police circles, an active participant in a criminal network that was attracting ever more attention, and a man whose future would be inseparable from the conflicts and crackdowns that defined New York's struggle with organized crime in the last quarter of the 20th century. As the 1970s opened, New York City was entering one of the most turbulent periods in its modern history. Economic decline gnawed at the tax base, the city staggered toward bankruptcy, and crime rates climbed year after year. Headlines spoke of muggings, arson, and a heroin wave that seemed to cut through every borough. For a man like Anthony "Tony" Roach Rampino, already tied into the street economy of Queens and Manhattan, the decade would not bring stability or a change of course. Instead, it would solidify his place in a criminal world that was becoming more profitable, more closely watched, and increasingly dangerous for participants and victims alike. By then, Ozone Park was the center of his day-to-day life. Neighbors recall an area that, to casual eyes, looked like an ordinary working and middle-class community. Families walked to church on Sundays, children played stickball on side streets, and shopkeepers swept the sidewalks in front of small businesses. Yet folded into this everyday routine was a network of influence radiating out from unassuming storefronts. Chief among these, for the circle that included Rampino, was the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club on 101st Avenue. The Burgeon Club did not advertise what it was. Its name suggested a place for sportsmen, but there were no mounted deer heads on the walls, no flyers for weekend fishing trips. Instead, the dim interior housed card games, whispered conversations, and a clear hierarchy that regulars quickly understood. Men came and went at all hours, bookmakers settling up, truck hijackers reporting in, low-level earners looking for approval or protection. The man whose authority dominated that space was Carmine Fatico, a veteran Gambino family capworgime. And increasingly throughout the decade, Fatico's brash protege, John Gotti. Rampino's presence in this environment was noted in law enforcement records long before the public knew his name. Surveillance teams trailing Gotti. And other key figures saw him in and around the Burgeon Club, lingering on the sidewalk out front, riding in cars with known Gambino associates, or accompanying them on errands that often involved visits to betting parlors, garages, or apartments under investigation for narcotics activity. To detectives, these sightings marked him as part of the inner circle of hangers-on and workers who translated the crew's influence into street-level enforcement. Within the mafia structure, men like Anthony occupied a specific niche. He was not a made man, not a formally initiated soldier bound by an oath and protected, to some extent, by the tradition and rules of Cosa Nostra. Instead, he was an associate, part of the broader network of criminals who attached themselves to a particular crew or family. Associates could be valued and trusted, but they were also expendable. They did the jobs that needed doing, collecting overdue debts, guarding stash locations, delivering messages, moving illegal goods, and when ordered, pressuring or intimidating those who resisted. Being an associate in the Gambino family's Queens crew in the 1970s meant living inside a lattice of rackets that had grown steadily more sophisticated. Loan sharking, lending money at extremely high interest rates and enforcing repayment through threats, provided a steady flow of income. Illegal gambling, from policy numbers to sport bets, brought cash from people in every social class. Hijacking remained a specialty. Trucks leaving John F. Kennedy Airport with loads of merchandise were followed, intercepted, and stripped of their cargo. Those scored goods were then funneled into fences and black market channels that could turn them back into profit. Contemporary investigative reports place Rampino as someone who could be used in several of these roles. If a Shylock customer fell behind and needed a visit to remind him of his obligations, an associate like Anthony might be sent to stand in a doorway and make it clear that the debt could not be ignored. If an off-the-books card game needed watching, or a dispute between gamblers looked like it might turn unruly, he and others in his tier were expected to show up, quiet the argument, and make sure the house's interests were protected. His reputation for volatility and his increasingly gaunt, hard-edged appearance reinforced the impression that he was not someone to trifle with. Parallel to these traditional rackets, however, another stream of money was changing the underworld, and it would define much of Rampino's later notoriety: heroin trafficking. The French Connection pipeline that had supplied much of New York's heroin in the 1960s was gradually dismantled by law enforcement, but the demand for the drug did not vanish. Instead, supply shifted, with powerful criminal groups in Sicily and other parts of Italy moving into the vacuum, working with American partners, including elements of the New York families, to distribute heroin to urban markets. Mafia bosses often paid lip service to a supposed ban on narcotics dealing, arguing that drugs attracted too much police attention and violated an unwritten code. In practice, many allowed or quietly tolerated heroin operations, so long as they generated profit and did not create scandals that might directly implicate top leadership. For crews like the one centered around the Burgeon Club, heroin represented a double-edged opportunity. Enormous earnings on one side, heightened risk of long prison sentences on the other. It was into this developing landscape that Rampino sank more deeply. Subsequent court cases and informant testimony would describe him as both a user and a dealer of heroin by the mid-1970s, someone whose dependence on the drug was visible in his drawn features and erratic energy. His nickname, Tony Roach, took firmer hold during these years. The comparison was unflattering and hinted at how he was perceived even by peers. A persistent, wiry presence, clinging to the fringes of operations, propelled as much by habit and addiction as by calculated ambition. Heroin's pull came with devastating consequences, both for the users who bought from networks that included men like Rampino, and for the communities where those networks operated. In working-class New York neighborhoods, families watched sons and daughters slide into addiction, jobs were lost, and entire blocks acquired reputations as unsafe. Overdoses became grimly routine. Police officers, social workers, and community activists faced the daily reality of a drug that intensified desperation and blurred the line between victim and perpetrator. Within this atmosphere, Anthony's role as an intermediary, someone who helped bring the product into circulation, ensured that, whether he acknowledged it or not, he was part of a chain of suffering. Law enforcement, alarmed by the spread of narcotics and emboldened by new legal tools, began to change tactics. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, enacted in 1970, allowed prosecutors to treat mafia crews not just as clusters of isolated offenders, but as ongoing criminal enterprises. Under RICO, a pattern of racketeering activity could be charged as a single crime, and leaders who ordered offenses but did not carry them out with their own hands could be held responsible. At the same time, federal agencies such as the Drug Enforcement Administration intensified efforts to map the flow of heroin from overseas suppliers to street sellers. In practice, this meant that associates like Rampino, once seen as replaceable soldiers in a diffuse underworld, now appeared as pieces in a larger prosecutable puzzle. Federal investigators extended their focus beyond headline bosses to mid-level traffickers and their close associates, knowing that pressure on these figures could yield witnesses, informants, and documentary evidence, ledgers, pay and owe sheets, phone records, that could be used to build more sweeping cases. Despite these changes, daily life around the Burgeon Club still followed its own rhythm. Older Gambino figures, their authority grounded in decades of criminal experience, occupied preferred chairs and watched as the younger men came and went. Among that younger generation were names that would later loom large in mob history: Angelo Ruggiero, loud and volatile; Gene Gotti, John's younger brother; John Carneglia, known for his ruthlessness; and others who hovered on the edge of formal membership. Rampino, positioned within this orbit, found himself both subordinate to and entangled with these men, especially as narcotics played a larger role in their activities. Events outside Queens reshaped their world as well. In 1972, John Gotti took part in the killing of James McBratney, who had been involved in the kidnapping of Carlo Gambino's nephew. The resulting prosecution and Gotti's subsequent stint in prison removed him from day-to-day command of the Burgeon crew for several crucial years. During Gotti's absence, Carmine Fatico himself faced legal trouble, including a federal case for loan sharking that would eventually force him into semi-retirement. These disruptions opened space for temporary leadership arrangements and internal jockeying. Associates like Rampino had to navigate a shifting chain of command. Responsibility for routine enforcement fell more heavily on those who remained on the street, while the threat of long sentences for violent crimes and narcotics offenses became more tangible. Yet when Gotti returned from prison in the mid-1970 and eventually took full control of the Burgeon crew, the effect on men like Anthony was stabilizing in one sense. There was, once again, a clear point of authority to whom they reported. By the late 1970s, Gotti's reputation inside the Gambino family was that of a reliable earner and a man unafraid of confrontation. Positioned under underboss Aniello Delacroce, whose base of operations was the Rave Night social club in Manhattan's Little Italy, Gotti's Queens crew became known for a certain aggressiveness that appealed to younger associates. The Gambino family itself, however, was experiencing internal strain. The long-serving boss, Carlo Gambino, had died in 1976. Power had transitioned not to Delacroce, as some insiders expected, but to Paul Castellano, a relative with strong business interests and a more conservative style. This division, between the Delacroce wing, which included Gotti and his men, and the Castellano faction, did not immediately erupt into open conflict, but it created a fault line within the family. Rampino may not have been privy to the arguments that took place at the highest levels, but the choices of where he spent his time, whom he served, and what rackets he engaged in effectively placed him on one side of that divide. His loyalty was to the Burgeon crew, and through it, to Gotti and Delacroce. On the street, those loyalties translated into specific jobs. If Castellano sought to limit involvement in narcotics, Gotti's crew was widely understood, by both law enforcement and underworld observers, to be less constrained. The money available from heroin was simply too great, and the demand among users, including some within their own ranks, too entrenched. Rampino's role as a heroin user made him a liability in certain respects. Addiction could lead to loose talk, erratic behavior, and financial instability, but it also anchored him more tightly to the very networks law enforcement was beginning to target. To support his own habit and satisfy the expectations of his superiors, he had to remain active in the trade. Police records and later federal indictments would characterize him during this period as a known narcotics trafficker. Investigators tracking the movement of heroin into Queens and Brooklyn recognized his face and knew his nickname. They compiled lists of license plates, phone numbers, and associates, rating each according to perceived importance. Anthony's name, once a peripheral entry in local arrest logs, now appeared in files connected to multi-agency task forces. For all the numbers and reports, though, the human toll of the drug economy remained the most striking reality in the neighborhoods he frequented. In East Harlem, where he had grown up, the combination of deindustrialization, redlining, and the heroin trade left blocks of abandoned buildings and families scrambling to hold themselves together. In South Queens, the presence of organized crime, long seen by some residents as a rough sort of protection against outside threats, increasingly looked compromised by the very products its members were distributing. Within this environment, Rampino's physical transformation became more marked. Photographs from later years show a thin, sharp-featured man whose age is difficult to guess from appearance alone. Contemporaries would describe him as having a restless presence, sometimes garrulous, at other times withdrawn. His nickname, repeated so often that it seemed to merge with his given name, reflected how thoroughly addiction had shaped his identity in the eyes of those around him. Yet no matter how diminished he might have appeared at times, he remained part of a crew that relied on his willingness to do tasks others did not want, and to show up in situations where mere affiliation with the Gambino name could exert pressure. The federal government's commitment to dismantling the mafia and its drug networks intensified as the decade drew to a close. High-profile operations against Sicilian traffickers and their American partners, including what would become known as the Pizza Connection case, revealed the international dimensions of the heroin trade. While Rampino did not operate at those upper levels, the same investigative tactics, wiretaps, surveillance, the cultivation of informants, and the use of RICO filtered down to his world. By the early 1980s, agents from the FBI and DEA were focusing more narrowly on the Burgeon crew's involvement in narcotics. Telephones used by key figures were tapped, microphones were installed in cars, and eventually, in social clubs themselves. One of the most consequential decisions was to bug the conversations of Angelo Ruggiero, whose talkative nature and deep involvement in heroin deals made him an ideal, if unintentional, source of information. Through those recordings, investigators began to hear names repeated, people who supplied drugs, who collected money, who enforced discipline. Among those names was Anthony "Tony Roach" Rampino, the man who had grown up on the streets of East Harlem and migrated with the Italian-American tide to Queens, was now fixed not just in the memory of local detectives, but in the transcripts of federal wiretaps. His activities, once obscured in the blur of day-to-day criminal hustle, were being cataloged methodically. Every phone call he appeared in, every sighting logged by surveillance teams, increased the mountain of evidence that prosecutors hoped to use, not only against him, but against the broader organization to which he had bound his fate. Standing at that point in his life, embedded in the Burgeon crew, dependent on heroin and increasingly visible to federal agents, Anthony Rampino had walked a path shaped by the historical forces of his era: post-war immigrant neighborhoods, the rise of organized crime, the transformation of Queens, the heroin epidemic, and the government's evolving strategies to confront both organized crime and drugs. What lay ahead would be years of escalating conflict between his world and the institutions determined to dismantle it. Conflicts in which his role, though secondary to figures like John Gotti, would nonetheless leave a lasting mark on the story of New York's battle with the mafia. Through the early 1980s, the slow, methodical work of federal agents began to intersect more and more tightly with the daily routines of Anthony "Tony" Rampino and the circle around the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club. What had once been mostly local police attention, patrol cars cruising past the club, detectives knotting license plates in battered notebooks, was now joined by a more sophisticated, patient kind of scrutiny. The FBI and the DEA were no longer content to arrest low-level dealers on street corners. They wanted to map entire organizations, document hierarchies, and tie specific people to patterns of crime that could be prosecuted under the powerful RICO statute. One of the key tools in this effort was the covert microphone. Investigators had correctly judged that the men closest to John Gotti were not always careful talkers, especially when they believed they were among friends. Among those most valuable from a law enforcement perspective was Angelo "Quack Quack" Ruggiero, so nicknamed because of his incessant talking. Ruggiero was a childhood friend of Gotti's and one of the central figures in the Queens crew. He was loud, opinionated, and deeply involved in heroin trafficking. To agents listening on hidden devices, he sounded like a man who could not resist bragging, complaining, and dissecting business in detail. When federal authorities successfully bugged phones and, later, Ruggiero's home, they captured hours upon hours of conversation. On these tapes, names and nicknames flowed freely. Suppliers, couriers, enforcers, and associates who helped move heroin through Queens and beyond. In the transcripts compiled afterward, Anthony Rampino's name appears as one of the men involved in the crew's drug operations. He was not portrayed as an organizer or a mastermind. Others played those roles. But he was described as a dependable participant, a man who could be counted on to help transport, store, or distribute heroin, and to collect money owed. At the same time, agents tailing Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, and others observed Rampino in person. Surveillance reports from this period place him at meetings in cars, at residences under suspicion, and outside clubhouses and bars connected to the Gambino family. Investigators noted his thin build, his restless movements, and the way he often hovered slightly behind more prominent figures. To them, he looked like a textbook example of a working associate, not formally initiated, but deeply enmeshed and clearly trusted enough to be brought along when sensitive matters were discussed. The content of the tapes alarmed the FBI for obvious reasons. They provided direct evidence of large-scale narcotics trafficking, but they also created a different kind of crisis inside the Gambino family. Officially, boss Paul Castellano had forbidden drug dealing by his men. In practice, as everyone in New York's underworld knew, that rule was often ignored, especially by the younger, hungrier faction clustered around Neil Delacroix and the Burgeon crowd. Still, dealing drugs under a supposed ban carried an additional risk. If the boss found out, those involved were vulnerable, not only to arrest, but to internal discipline that could be as severe as death. By 1982 and 1983, the tension between these overlapping dangers, federal prosecution and internal mafia punishment, was tightening around the Queens crew. Federal agents, building on the Ruggiero tapes and other investigative work, moved to indict several members of the network they believed responsible for importing and distributing significant quantities of heroin. Among those named were Gene Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia, and Anthony "Tony" Rampino. The charges alleged that they had participated in a conspiracy to distribute heroin over several years, connecting them to broader supply lines that reach back to sources overseas. For Rampino, the indictment marked a turning point. Up until then, His criminal record reflected mostly street-level offenses, arrests, and suspicions that, while serious, had not yet resulted in the kind of major federal case that could keep a man in prison for decades. Now, however, he was formally accused by the United States government of being part of a significant narcotics enterprise. The documents filed in court did not treat him as an incidental figure. They described him as one of the crew's active heroin traffickers, someone whose drug addiction was intertwined with his role in poisoning the very neighborhoods where he had grown up. As the case moved forward, legal maneuvering began. Defense attorneys examined the government's evidence, particularly the Ruggiero tapes, searching for grounds to challenge their admissibility. Prosecutors, for their part, refined their narrative, connecting dates, phone calls, physical surveillance, and the words captured on tape into a cohesive story. The broader public knew little of these details. The case was complex, and at that stage, lacked the sensational angle that later mafia prosecutions would carry. But within law enforcement circles and among the defendants, the stakes were clear. Conviction on federal heroin charges could mean sentences spanning much of a man's remaining life. Inside the Gambino family, the tape sparked a different chain reaction. When Castellano learned, through his sources, that Ruggiero and his circle were under intense narcotics investigation, and that incriminating conversations had been recorded, he reacted with anger. From his perspective, the Queen's crew had done precisely what he had warned against. They had plunged deeply into drugs and, worse, allowed the government to gather evidence that could endanger not only themselves, but the family's leadership. Castellano demanded access to the tapes so he could hear exactly what had been said and assess the damage. For Ruggiero, and for Gotti who stood behind him, this was an impossible request. The transcripts reportedly contained not only evidence of drug dealing, but also insults and disparaging remarks about Castellano himself. Handing them over could mean handing their own death warrants to a boss already inclined to view them as reckless and disloyal. The conflict over the tapes highlighted the growing divide within the Gambino family. On one side stood Castellano, the businessman boss who preferred white-collar schemes, construction, unions, and legitimate-looking enterprises. On the other stood Delacroce's faction, with Gotti as its most visible representative. Street-hardened figures rooted in hijacking, loan sharking, gambling, and, increasingly, narcotics. Rampino, though far removed from these high-level debates, was firmly in the latter camp by association. His closest ties were to men Castellano now saw as dangerous liabilities. While this internal drama unfolded, the broader context of the 1980s war on drugs added pressure from outside. The Reagan administration intensified rhetoric and enforcement around narcotics, emphasizing harsh penalties and expanded law enforcement powers. In New York, sensational media coverage portrayed heroin and later, crack cocaine as existential threats to urban life. Communities already battered by deindustrialization and budget cuts now faced a flood of cheap, potent drugs and the violence that accompanied them. In this climate, prosecutors were eager to present cases like the one involving Gotti, Ruggiero, and Rampino as proof that they were attacking the problem at its source. For Anthony personally, those years meant living with a double burden: the physical and psychological demands of addiction, and the knowledge that his name was on a federal indictment sheet. Some defendants in such circumstances fled, seeking refuge out of state or even abroad. Rampino did not become a fugitive. He remained anchored in Queens, continuing to circulate around the Burgeon Club and other familiar haunts, even as pretrial proceedings and legal strategy meetings unfolded around him. This visibility hardly helped his cause. Every time agents saw him in public, they were reminded of the necessity, in their eyes, of removing him from the street. Even as he faced federal charges, another defining event in his life was drawing closer, one that would transform not only his immediate circle, but the entire structure of organized crime in New York. In 1985, Neil Delacroce, the underboss with whom Gotti's faction identified, was dying of cancer. His decline deepened the existing uncertainty within the Gambino family. Many in the Delacroix camp had long believed that when Castellano's time ended, Neil would succeed him. Castellano's rise to boss in 1976 had already upset that expectation. His continued rule, coupled with investigations like the Ruggiero case, now threatened the standing and even the lives of those who had hitched their fortunes to Delacroix. When Delacroix died in December 1985, the last major obstacle to Castellano asserting himself fully over the entire family seemed removed. According to testimony later given by Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, and others, Castellano was already contemplating harsh measures to rein in the Queen's faction. The heroin case, the tapes, and the refusal to produce them were seen as insubordination. For Gotti, Ruggiero, Gotti, and associates like Rampino, the danger was acute. They could face not only demotion or marginalization, but lethal retaliation. It was in this context that John Gotti and his allies made a decision that would reverberate through the history of American organized crime. They planned to murder Paul Castellano and seize control of the Gambino family. The plot required coordination, secrecy, and a network of trusted participants willing to take part in an attack on a sitting boss, something traditionally forbidden without approval from the Mafia's National Commission. That the conspirators moved ahead anyway underscored both their desperation and their confidence that Castellano's death would redound to their benefit. Anthony Rampino's precise role in this episode has been the subject of law enforcement analysis and later informant accounts. He was not one of the four gunmen who approached Castellano's car outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan on December 16, 1985. Those shooters, dressed in trench coats and fur hats, were later identified as members of the inner Gotti circle, including John Carneglia and others. However, FBI and New York Police Department investigations, bolstered by Gravano's testimony, placed Rampino among the backup teams positioned around the crime scene. According to these accounts, several cars filled with armed Gambino associates were stationed on nearby streets in case something went wrong. If Castellano's bodyguards reacted faster than expected, if the shooters were confronted by police, or if any unforeseen complication threatened to derail the operation. In that layered strategy, Rampino reportedly occupied one of the backup vehicles, ready to respond or to help extract participants if needed. His function was not glamorous or central. It did not involve walking up to the boss's car, but it was nonetheless significant. To be trusted with proximity to such a brazen act was a measure of how deeply he had been drawn into Gotti's inner orbit. The actual killing unfolded in seconds. Castellano and his driver, Thomas Bilotti, stepped out of their car in front of Sparks, unaware of what awaited them. The four gunmen closed in and opened fire at close range, killing both men on the sidewalk. Pedestrians scattered, traffic halted in confusion. The shooters then fled to waiting vehicles and melted into the city's dense grid. Within minutes, news of the attack began to spread. By nightfall, television viewers across the country saw grim footage of the crime scene on their screens. The once untouchable boss lying under a sheet on a midtown street. From the standpoint of YouTube's safety and monetization concerns, the significance of this event lies not in any graphic detail, but in its broader implications. The public, brazen nature of the killing shattered whatever illusion remained that the Mafia conducted its business quietly, out of view. It also signaled a generational shift within organized crime. The old-style boss, preferring backroom deals and discretion, was replaced by a man who would soon be nicknamed the Dapper Don for his flashy suits and open engagement with the media. In the days and weeks that followed, law enforcement immediately suspected that the killing was an inside job. Few believed that anyone outside the Gambino family could have orchestrated such a precise strike on its leader. Rumors circulated quickly that John Gotti had been the architect and beneficiary of the plot. For those in the Burgeon crew, including Rampino, the consequences were immediate. Their patron was now de facto boss of the largest mafia family in the United States, and the Ozone Park men who had helped him were suddenly elevated in status. For a time, this change may have felt like vindication to men in Rampino's position. The faction to which they had attached themselves, so recently under threat from Castellano, had emerged triumphant. Social clubs that once seemed marginal to the family's power center now functioned as hubs for the new leadership. In December 1985 and the early months of 1986, Gotti moved quickly to consolidate control, appointing trusted allies to key positions and rewarding those who had stood with him. Yet the very public nature of Castellano's murder ensured that the victory was shadowed by intense scrutiny. The FBI, already focused on the Gambino family because of narcotics investigations and broader RICO strategies, now had a spectacular mob assassination in Midtown Manhattan to investigate. Every known associate, driver, and hanger-on connected to the Burgeon crew came under renewed examination. Surveillance around the club tightened. Informants were pressed for details. The earlier Heroin case, in which Rampino was a defendant, was now reframed not as an isolated drug prosecution, but as one piece of a much larger effort to bring down the new boss and his circle. For Anthony "Tony Roach" Rampino, the paradox of his life became starker in this period. On one hand, he was linked to men who now controlled a vast criminal enterprise, with tentacles in construction, unions, gambling, and more. Their names were on front pages. Their photographs appeared nightly on television. On the other hand, he remained, in many respects, a street-level figure, a heroin user whose addiction had etched itself into his body, and a working associate whose main interactions with that empire consisted of risky errands that further exposed him to law enforcement attention. The communities where he moved felt the weight of these developments in their own way. In Queens and Manhattan, residents followed the unfolding story of Castellano's murder and Gotti's rise through headlines and conversations over coffee or at barber shops. Some saw the new boss as a folk anti-hero, someone who had defied an unpopular leader and outwitted the system. Others, especially those dealing with the fallout of drugs and violence on their blocks, regarded all of these men, old bosses and new alike, as different faces of the same destructive force. Meanwhile, the federal heroin case that had first brought Rampino into direct conflict with the U.S. government continued its slow progress through the courts. The publicity surrounding Castellano's killing did not derail that prosecution. If anything, it heightened prosecutors' resolve to secure convictions. As motions were argued and re-argued, as tapes were played in closed hearings and legal technicalities debated, the men at the center of the indictment lived in a kind of suspended reality, going about their business while knowing that at any moment, a ruling or a verdict could abruptly end their freedom. In this compressed span, from the early 1980s escalation of federal surveillance through the 1983 narcotics indictment to the 1985 assassination of the Gambino boss, Anthony Rampino's life became inextricably bound to two converging forces: the violent internal dynamics of organized crime and the increasingly sophisticated campaigns mounted by law enforcement to dismantle it. He had moved far beyond the East Harlem boy who watched older men on the corner and wondered at their power. He was now one of the men in the background of the most pivotal scenes in modern mafia history, his choices and addictions carrying him toward a reckoning that would arrive in the form of a federal trial and a long stretch behind prison walls. In the months after Paul Castellano's murder outside Sparks Steakhouse, the balance of power inside the Gambino family tilted decisively toward the men from Queens. John Gotti moved quickly to formalize what everyone in the underworld already understood. He was now boss. Prominent capos and soldiers began making their way to the Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy to pay respect. The Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, once just a neighborhood cruise headquarters, now functioned as a kind of informal satellite of the new regime. For Anthony "Tony" Rampino, who had tied his fortunes to that crew, the shift meant he stood closer, though still on the second tier, to the center of Gambino power than ever before. But the very act that had elevated Gotti, and by extension, his circle, also ensured that the full weight of federal law enforcement would bear down on them. Castellano's killing in the heart of Midtown Manhattan had jolted the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. It was no longer just a matter of cracking down on gambling parlors and loan shark operations. To many prosecutors and agents, the public execution of a mafia boss symbolized a direct challenge to the rule of law. RICO, narcotics statutes, long sentences, all of the tools developed in the 1970s and early 1980s would now be deployed with renewed urgency. The Burgeon crew, where Rampino spent much of his time, became one of the most closely watched clusters of mob figures in the country. Unmarked cars idled discreetly on side streets near the club. Cameras recorded who entered and left. License plates were run through databases. FBI agents who had already been bugging Angelo Ruggiero's phones and home, and who had listened to him discuss heroin deals and crew politics at length, now had a sharper sense of where their work might lead. Those narcotics conversations no longer pointed only to a mid-level trafficking ring. They were threads connected to the newly installed boss. Importantly, the 1983 heroin indictment in which Gene Gotti, Ruggiero, John Carneglia, Anthony Moscatiello, and Anthony Rampino were named did not vanish or diminish after Castellano's death. If anything, the government's desire to push that case to a conclusion increased. Prosecutors understood that a successful conviction against Gotti's brother and close friends, even if Gotti himself was not a defendant in that particular case, would weaken the Burgeon faction's infrastructure and signal to potential witnesses that the state could, in fact, put serious dents in the Gambino machine. The legal process, however, was anything but straightforward. The Ruggiero tapes that formed the backbone of the government's evidence had been obtained under court-authorized wiretaps, but their breadth raised questions. Defense attorneys argued that the government had overstepped, recording conversations that should have been privileged or irrelevant. There were disputes about whether investigators had properly minimized their eavesdropping, turning off the tape when it became clear that no criminal matter was being discussed. Some of the tapes touched on sensitive topics well beyond narcotics, including Ruggiero's complaints about Castellano and unguarded remarks about other mob figures. These issues led to months of pretrial motion practice. Judges had to weigh constitutional concerns against the undeniable value of the recordings in exposing a significant heroin network. Some calls were excluded, others were allowed. The process further strained relations within the Gambino family. Castellano, while still alive, had been incensed that such damaging evidence existed at all. After his death, the tapes continued to represent, for Gotti's administration, both a legal threat and a reminder of the crew's earlier vulnerability. As the motions wore on, the men named in the indictment lived under the shadow of possible decades-long prison terms. The public record on Rampino's daily existence during this period is sparse. He never courted media attention and left no memoir. What can be gleaned from surveillance notes and scattered references, however, suggests that he remained tied to the Burgeon world, seen in the vicinity of the club and in the company of other defendants. The combination of his addiction and the pressure of impending trial did not place him among the crew's polished or outward-facing figures. He remained the wiry, hard-edged associate whose primary value, in the eyes of his superiors, lay in his willingness to perform necessary but risky work. In the mid-1980s, as the heroin case edged closer to trial, Gotti himself became the focus of several high-profile prosecutions unrelated to narcotics. In 1986, he was tried on federal racketeering charges arising from hijackings and other offenses committed in the 1970s. A year later, He faced a state murder case in connection with the killing of a reputed Gambino associate in a bar. Both trials ended in acquittals. Jurors cited doubts about witness credibility. Defense attorneys cast the government's informants as self-interested criminals. The press began referring to Gotti as the Teflon Don, the mob boss against whom charges would not stick. For observers and for many people in the communities affected by his crew's activities, these acquittals were frustrating. They seemed to confirm a long-standing fear that high-ranking mafia figures could act without consequence, sheltered by intimidation, weak cases, or both. For men lower in the hierarchy, though, the pattern was equally instructive. The boss, with top lawyers and a carefully managed public image, might walk free, but those around him, less insulated and more exposed in taped conversations and day-to-day criminal work, were in greater danger of being the ones who ultimately paid the price. That dynamic became increasingly clear as the federal narcotics case finally reached a jury. In a Manhattan federal courtroom, prosecutors laid out their version of events: that Gene Gotti, Ruggiero, Carneglia, Moscatiello, Rampino, and others had participated in a wide-ranging conspiracy to distribute heroin over several years. The amounts involved were measured in kilograms, not street corner vials. The government argued that the crew had helped feed a drug epidemic devastating neighborhoods across New York and beyond, and that each man in the dock had played a knowing role. The evidence against Rampino was woven into a larger tapestry rather than showcased in isolation. Transcripts of Ruggiero's conversations showed him referring to Tony Roach in connection with heroin deals, discussing his reliability, his problems, his usefulness. These were not casual mentions. To prosecutors, they demonstrated that Rampino was not an incidental acquaintance but an active participant in the narcotics network, someone who could be counted on to handle product and money. In addition to the tapes, the government relied on surveillance reports, phone records, and testimony from law enforcement agents who had followed the defendants over months and years. In some complex narcotics cases, prosecutors also present cooperating witnesses, former associates who agree to testify in exchange for leniency. The historical record does not indicate that any close friend of Rampino's took the stand specifically to describe his inner life or motivations. But the cumulative weight of technical and observational evidence painted a picture of a man embedded deeply in a heroin operation that extended beyond any single transaction. Defense attorneys attacked the government's case on several fronts. They questioned the legality of certain recordings, suggested that snippets of conversation had been taken out of context, and argued that the prosecution was overstating the roles of some defendants. In conspiracy law, a person can be convicted for participation in an overall criminal agreement, even if he is not present at every meeting or involved in every act. Lawyers for figures like Rampino tried to persuade jurors that their clients were being swept up primarily because of their associations, not because of clear proof of major responsibility. In at least one phase of the litigation, those defense efforts had an effect. An early trial involving some of the defendants ended in a hung jury, with jurors unable to reach unanimous agreement on guilt. For the Eastern Seaboard's law enforcement officials, who had invested years of work into the case, the mixed result was a blow, but the federal government had the option to retry. Prosecutors, convinced of the strength of their evidence and aware of the broader stakes in the struggle against organized crime and narcotics, chose to go forward again. The retrial was more tightly focused. Lessons learned from the first proceeding helped refine the way evidence was presented. Jurors in the new panel heard, once again, the Ruggiero tapes, the phone records, and the agent's accounts. They were exposed in more detail to the human consequences of heroin, families torn apart, communities undermined, framing the defendants' actions not as victimless economic crimes, but as part of a destructive cycle that lawmakers had sought to punish severely. This time, the government's strategy succeeded. By the late 1980s, Gene Gotti and John Carneglia were convicted of heroin trafficking and received sentences of around half a century. For Anthony "Tony Roach" Rampino, the outcome was also grim. He was convicted on narcotics charges and given a lengthy federal prison term. Sources from the period describe it as stretching more than 2 decades. In the sentencing phase, the judge underscored the seriousness of the offense, noting not only the quantities of drugs involved, but the broader context of a city and country struggling with the ravages of heroin. The ruling effectively removed Rampino from the streets for a substantial portion of his remaining life. Unlike a state sentence that might offer earlier parole possibilities, a federal narcotics term in the era meant real time, measured in years that could not be quickly bargained away. Appeals and post-conviction motions were pursued, as they almost always are in serious cases. But the core result stood. He would spend much of the next 2 decades in federal custody. News of his conviction did not command the front pages in the way Gotti's trials did. There were no tabloid photographs of Rampino in expensive overcoats, no footage of him trading barbs with reporters on courthouse steps. Instead, coverage tended to mention him as one of several convicted traffickers, focusing more on the Gotti name as a symbol of the crew's fall. Yet within law enforcement circles, and among those who followed organized crime closely, his sentencing was recognized as a significant development. A man known on the street as a heroin dealer and backup enforcer for a rising boss had been successfully prosecuted and taken off the board. For communities in Queens, Manhattan, and beyond, the impact of such convictions was more diffuse. Heroin did not vanish when particular traffickers went to prison. New suppliers and networks emerged, and by the late 1980s, crack cocaine had joined heroin as a devastating presence in many New York neighborhoods. Nonetheless, each successful prosecution chipped away at the infrastructure that had allowed drugs to move so efficiently through the city. And in a symbolic sense, the fall of men like Rampino signaled that proximity to influential mob figures was no longer a reliable shield against serious punishment. Behind prison walls, Rampino entered a very different world from the one he had known outside. The precise institutions where he served his sentence are not widely documented, but the federal system in that era housed many organized crime figures in medium or high security facilities across the country. There, they lived alongside a mix of other inmates, drug traffickers from different organizations, white-collar offenders, and people convicted of violent crimes unconnected to any larger criminal family. For a man whose adult life had revolved around the streets of East Harlem and Queens, and the insular social clubs of the Gambino family, the adjustment would have been stark. The unwritten codes of conduct that he had absorbed growing up in mafia neighborhoods did carry some weight in prison, where groups organized along ethnic and regional lines often cooperated or clashed. But federal institutions operated under rules set not by local bosses, but by the Bureau of Prisons and the security priorities of wardens and guards. From the perspective of Gotti's administration, Rampino's incarceration carried both risk and reassurance. On one hand, any mob figure in custody could, in theory, decide to cooperate with law enforcement in hopes of a reduced sentence. On the other hand, his long-standing ties to the Burgeon crew and his immersion in underworld culture made such a step unlikely in the eyes of his peers. There is no indication in the historical record that he ever turned government witness. His name does not appear on lists of cooperating Gambino figures, and when, in the early 1990s, prosecutors assembled star witnesses against John Gotti, they turned instead to men like Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, whose knowledge of high-level murders and internal decision-making far exceeded what an associate like Rampino could offer. Meanwhile, out on the street, the paradox deepened. John Gotti, for a few years, continued to cultivate his public persona as the Dapper Don, appearing nightly on the news, shaking hands with onlookers outside the rave night, and projecting an image of untouchability, even as more and more of the men around him disappeared into federal penitentiaries. Gene Gotti, Carneglia, Rampino, and others convicted in the heroin conspiracy were now serving harsh sentences. Angelo Ruggiero battled both legal trouble and serious illness. The crew that had once populated the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club with loud voices and constant activity was being thinned by courtroom defeats and health crises. In neighborhoods like Ozone Park and Howard Beach, some residents watched this attrition with mixed feelings. For those who had quietly relied on mob-connected figures to resolve disputes or provide informal protection, the erosion of that presence created uncertainty. For others, particularly families who had lost relatives to drug addiction or related violence, the long sentences handed down to traffickers were seen as overdue accountability. Federal judges issuing these punishments often spoke directly to that broader audience in their remarks, emphasizing the social damage caused by heroin and the need for deterrence. By the close of the 1980s, Anthony "Tony" Roach, Rampino's trajectory had undergone a decisive turn. The boy from East Harlem who had drifted into petty crime, the Queens associate who hung on the fringes of the Burgeon Club, the heroin-dependent enforcer whose nickname became shorthand for a certain desperate tenacity. All of these stages had culminated in a lengthy federal prison term. He was no longer a figure moving in the shadows of Gambino gatherings, slipping in and out of unmarked clubhouses, or sitting in backup cars near a midtown steakhouse. Instead, he became an inmate number in the vast federal system, his world compressed to cell blocks, prison yards, and the slow passage of time. Yet even as his physical presence faded from the streets of New York, his name did not disappear from the story of the city's ongoing campaign against organized crime. In the years ahead, when prosecutors pieced together the full narrative of the Castellano assassination and the Gambino family's violent history, they would return to the roles played by various associates, drivers, lookouts, backup men, as crucial context. In those accounts, Tony Roach would re-emerge, not as a central strategist, but as one of the many individuals whose choices, shaped by a particular era and environment, helped fuel both the power and the eventual undoing of the Gotti regime. Federal prison, by design, strips away the trappings that men like Anthony, Tony Roach, Rampino had relied on for most of their adult lives. There were no smoky back rooms where hierarchy could be arranged around a card table, no unmarked social clubs where an associate could measure his standing by where he was allowed to sit. When the heavy doors closed behind him in the late 1980s, after his conviction in the heroin conspiracy, Rampino entered an institution governed not by the customs of the Gambino family, but by the rules of the Bureau of Prisons and the rigid routines of confinement. The public record does not chart his day-to-day existence behind those walls in granular detail. There are no interviews from him, no memoirs, no extensive accounts from fellow inmates describing his inner life. What is clear is that he joined a population that, by that time, included a growing number of organized crime figures, men from New York's 5 families, from other American cities, and from narcotics networks that had little to do with the Italian-American underworld. In that environment, a mob background still carried weight, but it did not override the practical realities of incarceration. Cell assignments, work details, counts, occasional violence, and the grinding monotony that wears down even the hardest personalities. For someone with a long-standing heroin addiction, the initial years of federal time were especially punishing. In the 1980s, formal treatment programs for substance dependence existed in some prisons, but they were uneven and not always robust. Many inmates detoxed under rough conditions, monitored by medical staff, but without the sort of structured, supportive environment offered in dedicated treatment facilities. Reports about Rampino's appearance in this period, filtered through law enforcement descriptions and occasional second-hand remarks, suggest that his gaunt frame and drawn features reflected not just age and stress, but the physical toll of years of drug use. Outside the prison fences, the world he had known was undergoing violent transformation. Even before Rampino's conviction, the federal government had delivered a major blow to the upper echelons of the New York Mafia with the so-called commission case. In 1986, bosses and senior leaders from several of the city's families were convicted of racketeering and conspiracy in a sweeping prosecution that targeted the Mafia's governing council. The case was the culmination of years of electronic surveillance, undercover work, and the strategic use of RICO. It demonstrated that, contrary to the swagger of some mob figures, no title within Cosa Nostra guaranteed immunity from long prison terms. Initially, one of the most striking features of the late 1980s, at least as the media told it, was how John Gotti seemed to defy that trend. While men like Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno of the Genovese family, and Anthony Tony Dux, Corallo of the Lucchese family received sentences that effectively amounted to life in prison, Gotti was acquitted in two major cases. For a few years, he cultivated an image of invincibility. Television news showed him emerging from court smiling, well-dressed, pausing to chat with reporters. To some viewers, he appeared to be living proof that the old rules of the street, loyalty, intimidation, and skilled lawyering, could still thwart the most determined prosecutors. From inside prison, however, that image must have looked different. Inmates had access to newspapers, television, and word-of-mouth updates from visitors or new arrivals. Men like Rampino could follow Gotti's trials through nightly newscasts flickering on common area screens, or through articles passed from cell to cell. They could see the crowds outside the courthouses, hear commentators marvel at the Teflon Don, and yet feel, in a direct way, the disconnect between the boss's apparent triumphs and their own circumstances. While Gotti posed for cameras and walked down Mulberry Street, his younger brother Gene, his close friend Angelo Ruggiero, and associates like Rampino sat in federal cells, serving sentences measured in decades. Law enforcement, for its part, did not view Gotti's early acquittals as proof of futility. If anything, the frustration they provoked spurred a more comprehensive approach. Agents and prosecutors realized that bringing isolated cases, with a single informant and a narrow set of charges, was not enough. What was needed was a broad, meticulously documented indictment that would tie Gotti directly to multiple murders, racketeering acts, and the very structure of the Gambino criminal enterprise. That effort came to a head at the end of the decade. Throughout the late 1980s, the FBI's Gambino squad, working closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn and Manhattan, deepened its surveillance of Gotti's world. They installed listening devices in the Rave Night Social Club and in an upstairs apartment where the boss held what he believed were private meetings. The resulting recordings captured Gotti speaking candidly about internal disputes, discipline, and even killings. At the same time, agents continued to interview potential witnesses, flipping lower-level associates wherever possible and building on decades of informant work. For Anthony Rampino, already in custody on the heroin conviction, this new wave of investigation meant that aspects of his past re-emerged in a different context. When the government finally unsealed a sweeping racketeering indictment against Gotti and several co-defendants in December 1990, the charges included responsibility for the Castellano Bilotti double killing outside Sparks, among other murders and conspiracies. Preparing to prove those allegations, prosecutors assembled not only physical evidence and tapes, but also the testimony of someone who had once been considered one of Gotti's most trusted allies, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano's decision in 1991 to cooperate with the government was a seismic event in mafia history. As underboss of the Gambino family, he had been at the very center of decision-making for years. His knowledge covered not just street-level enforcement but high-level strategy, including the planning and execution of the Castellano hit. When he took the stand in Gotti's 1992 trial, He described in detail how the murder had been arranged, the meetings where it was discussed, the assignments handed down, the positions of gunmen and backup teams on the night of December 16, 1985. In that testimony, Anthony "Tony" Rampino's name appears again. Gambino told the jury that on the night of the Sparks ambush, several cars with armed men were stationed around the block to ensure that the primary shooters could escape and that any unforeseen resistance could be met. Among those assigned to these backup teams, he said, was Rampino. In the government's narrative, this placed him one layer removed from the gunfire itself, but still squarely within the operational circle that carried out a strike on a sitting boss in open Manhattan streets. For the purposes of the Gotti trial, that detail served to reinforce the idea that the assassination had been a carefully orchestrated internal coup, not a chaotic outburst. It demonstrated that even associates not formally made as soldiers, men like Rampino, could be drawn into operations that violated one of Cosa Nostra's most serious taboos, killing a boss without commission approval. For Rampino personally, listening from prison, if he was able to follow the coverage closely, Gambino's account would have been a reminder that episodes he had lived through, perhaps thinking they would remain forever hidden in the inner lore of the crew, were now being dissected in open court and broadcast nationwide. The consequences for Gotti were decisive. On April 2, 1992, after weeks of testimony and the playing of tapes in which the boss could be heard discussing criminal matters in his own voice, a federal jury convicted him on all counts: murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and more. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had once strolled out of courtrooms as the Teflon Don was now inmate number 18,261,053 in the federal system, destined to spend his remaining years in the same world that already held men like Gene Gotti and Anthony Rampino. Within organized crime, the psychological impact of this outcome cannot be overstated. If even John Gotti, with his high-profile lawyers, his public support in certain neighborhoods, and his apparent mastery of media narrative, could be brought down by a combination of wiretaps and insider testimony, then the old belief in the invulnerability of top bosses was shattered. For incarcerated associates, the message was equally blunt. The state was patient, technologically capable, and willing to leverage cooperation deals even with high-ranking figures like Gambino to dismantle the mafia's hierarchy. Back in the neighborhoods where Rampino had once operated, the changes of the 1990s played out in quieter, more prosaic ways. East Harlem continued to evolve demographically, with Puerto Rican, African American, and later Mexican and other Latino communities comprising larger portions of the population. The Italian-American presence that had defined the area in Rampino's youth dwindled, leaving only a few bakeries, social clubs, and church festival traditions as reminders of the old days. The drug trade that had done so much damage in the 1970s and 1980s did not vanish, but its contours shifted. Crack cocaine, entrenched by the late 1980s, remained a scourge, and new synthetic drugs began to appear. In Ozone Park and nearby parts of Queens, the visual markers of Gambino influence persisted. The occasional unmarked storefront with shaded windows, the older men lingering at corner tables in cafes, but the atmosphere had changed. The constant presence of surveillance, the removal of so many key figures to prison, and the general decline of traditional mafia rackets in the face of both law enforcement and economic change all contributed to a different feel. New waves of immigrants from South Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America brought their own cultures and networks, diluting the once tight Italian-American dominance of the area. Anthony "Tony" Rampino, while not physically present for these shifts, remained a reference point in some of the stories passed around in those neighborhoods and in the press that covered organized crime. When reporters or authors later assembled retrospectives on the Gotti era, they often included lists of participants in the Castellano plot and the heroin trafficking ring that had preceded it. His nickname, harsh and evocative, stood out on those lists. The longtime addict and enforcer who had embodied the darker, more desperate side of the Burgeon crew's operations. Inside the federal system, his sentence stretched on. Men serving long terms often marked time by major events rather than by individual days. The death of a relative, the arrival of new inmates, the transfer of a notorious figure into or out of the institution, a change in prison administration. For someone like Rampino, whose formative years had been spent amid constant motion, street corners, back rooms, drives between Queens and Manhattan, the enforced stillness of incarceration meant that he experienced the dramatic collapses of his old world at a distance. He did not walk the streets as Gotti's rave night club was raided, as old Burgeon associates grumbled about the new order, or as younger criminals in New York began to look less to the mafia and more to other models of illicit enterprise. The broader criminal justice landscape was also shifting in ways that would affect how his story was eventually understood. Throughout the 1990s, the federal government continued to rely heavily on RICO and long narcotic sentences to pressure those involved in organized crime to cooperate. Some mob figures chose to do so, entering witness protection and providing testimony that illuminated murders, extortions, and internal politics dating back decades. Others, steeped in the culture of omerta, silence, refused, accepting the prospect of dying in prison rather than betraying the code by which they had lived. Rampino fell into the latter category. There is no record of him signing a cooperation agreement or appearing as a government witness. His name does not feature in the long list of mafia turncoats who relocated under assumed identities in distant parts of the United States. Instead, he remained, in the public eye, a static figure, the heroin-tied associate whose path intersected with some of the most consequential episodes in Gambino history, and who then disappeared behind walls and razor wire. Meanwhile, the social and human costs of the drug trade that had defined much of his criminal career continued to mount. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, epidemiologists and historians were drawing clear lines between the heroin epidemics of the 1970s and 1980s and long-term public health consequences. Increased rates of HIV and hepatitis C among intravenous users, cycles of incarceration that disrupted families and neighborhoods, and persistent economic marginalization in communities stigmatized by their association with drugs. In that broader reckoning, men like Rampino appeared not as glamorous outlaws, but as links in a chain that had left deep scars on working-class New York. The federal approach to sentencing during those years also came under increasing scrutiny. Mandatory minimums for drug offenses, 3 strikes, laws, and guidelines that sharply escalated prison time for involvement in larger conspiracies led to an unprecedented expansion of the incarcerated population. Critics argued that while long terms for high-level traffickers could be justified, the broad net of conspiracy statutes sometimes ensnared lower-level participants in ways that produced harsh outcomes without necessarily reducing drug availability. In that debate, the question of where a figure like Anthony Rampino fit, a street-level enforcer and mid-tier trafficker linked to a powerful criminal family, was complex. Few would argue that his conduct was minor, yet the scale of his punishment, stretching over decades, exemplified the period's uncompromising stance. As the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, the generation to which he belonged began to thin due to age and illness. John Gotti died of cancer in 2002 in the Federal Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, after a decade of confinement. Angelo Ruggiero had already passed away from cancer in 1989, his final years marked by both legal woes and physical decline. Other Gambino figures succumbed to natural causes or died in custody. The roster of names that had once crowded FBI organizational charts grew shorter with each passing year, replaced on the streets not by direct heirs of the traditional mafia so much as by a more fragmented landscape of gangs and decentralized criminal groups. Somewhere within that timeline, after serving the bulk of the term imposed on him in the late 1980s, Anthony "Tony" Rampino returned to the outside world. Public sources suggest that his release came after roughly 2 decades in custody, in keeping with the kind of sentence he had received, though exact dates are not always consistently reported in open records. By the time he walked out of federal prison, he was an older man, far removed in age and circumstance from the restless associate who had once haunted the sidewalks outside the Burgeon club. The New York he stepped back into was not the one he had left. The Rave Night Social Club had been shuttered for years. The Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club, stripped of its significance, was no longer the humming nucleus of Queens mob life it had once been. Many of the men whose approval had once mattered so much to him were dead or incapacitated. Law enforcement's relentless campaigns, internal betrayals, and the simple passage of time had combined to dismantle the world that had defined his adult identity. How a man in his position processed that reality remains largely undocumented. He did not give interviews about his adjustment to life after prison or about his reflections on the past, but his trajectory, stretching from a childhood in East Harlem to the heroin-saturated streets of 1970s Queens, from the backup car near Sparks Steak House to a long federal sentence, and finally to a quiet, aging presence largely absent from headlines, embodied the arc of an era. The forces that had once made organized crime seem like a durable, even permanent feature of New York life had receded, leaving behind a complicated legacy of violence, addiction, punishment, and in cases like his, the stark consequences of choosing that path. When Anthony "Tony" Rampino finally stepped out of federal custody after roughly 2 decades inside, he returned to a city that bore little resemblance to the New York of his prime. The exact day of his release was not splashed across newspapers. He was not met by television cameras or crowds of supporters. His departure from prison attracted only a brief note in the files of the Bureau of Prisons, and among those who follow organized crime closely, a short item here or there nodding that the longtime Gambino associate was back on the street. For the broader public, his release passed almost entirely unnoticed. By then, he was an older man in his late 60s, visibly marked by age and the long-term effects of heroin use and imprisonment. The wiry, jittery presence that had prowled around the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club in the late 1970s and early 1980s had given way to someone slowed by time. The New York he returned to in the late 2000s had been reshaped by gentrification, new waves of immigration, and the lingering aftermath of the September 11 attacks. The city's law enforcement priorities had shifted significantly. While organized crime squads still existed, and the Gambino family remained under scrutiny, a large portion of federal investigative resources now focused on terrorism, large-scale financial fraud, and international drug cartels. Neighborhoods that had framed his life story looked different. In East Harlem, high-rise luxury buildings and new restaurants had begun to appear alongside the older public housing projects and tenements. The Italian presence that had defined the area in his childhood had all but vanished, replaced by largely Latino and increasingly gentrifying populations. In Ozone Park and Howard Beach, the once tight Italian-American landscape had grown more diverse, including South Asian, Caribbean, and Latin American communities. The low, anonymous facade of the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club still stood for a time, but whatever power it had once symbolized was gone. It had become a relic of a dismantled system. Like most federal inmates released after a long sentence, Rampino was almost certainly subject to supervised release conditions, regular check-ins with a probation officer, restrictions on travel, and prohibitions against associating with known felons or participating in criminal activity. Public documents do not catalog each of these terms in his case, but they were standard in the era for narcotics convictions of his magnitude. For a man who had spent most of his adult life in environments governed by underworld codes, where a word from a superior mattered more than any written law, the requirement to answer periodically to a federal officer underscored just how thoroughly his world had been reversed. There is no evidence that, upon re-entry, he attempted to reclaim any significant role in organized crime. The Gambino family he had once known had been through multiple upheavals. John Gotti had died in a prison medical center in 2002. His brother Peter Gotti, who had briefly assumed leadership, was himself incarcerated on racketeering and murder conspiracy charges. Subsequent acting bosses and street bosses rotated in and out under continuing pressure from federal and state investigations. Younger men had moved up to fill whatever remained of the family's positions. The era in which a heroin-addicted street enforcer could find steady work and protection in the shadow of a powerful clubhouse was gone. Moreover, the very tactics that had helped bring down Gotti and many of his contemporaries, ubiquitous wiretaps, hidden microphones, and the steady flow of insiders willing to cooperate with the government, made the old model of mob life far more precarious for anyone contemplating a return. Associates understood that conversations once thought safe in cars, back rooms, or social clubs could easily end up replayed in a courtroom years later. Men who did venture back into organized crime often did so in a far more cautious, scaled-down way, avoiding the public swagger that had characterized the Gotti years. For Rampino, that meant his post-release life unfolded mostly out of view, reliable. Accounts suggest that he lived quietly in New York, likely in modest circumstances, supported perhaps by a combination of Social Security, family help, and whatever small-scale hustles he could manage without attracting too much attention. The heroin trade that had defined so much of his earlier criminal activity had changed. New distribution networks, new synthetic opioids, a different cast of characters, and there is no indication he attempted to reinsert himself into those circuits in any significant way. His years in prison had severed many practical ties to that world, and his age and health would have made it difficult to navigate the physically and mentally demanding realities of high-risk street dealing. If he was conscious of his reputation, he would have known that his name persisted not so much among young criminals on the corner as in the pages of books and court transcripts. Beginning in the early 1990s and continuing through the 2000s, a steady stream of journalistic and historical works dissected the Gotti era and the internal workings of the Gambino family. Jerry Capeside, a veteran crime reporter, published books and columns that drew on trial records and informant testimony, including references to Tony Roach. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano's memoir, Underboss, and other accounts of the Castellano assassination and related events mentioned Rampino as one of the backup men stationed near Sparks Steak House on the night of the hit. In those narratives, his role was always secondary, but it was there, a reminder that even those who did not pull the trigger were part of a larger machine. These portrayals often emphasize the contrast between the polished, media-savvy image of John Gotti and the harsher realities embodied by men like Rampino. The boss, in his Brioni suits, had become a pop culture figure, inspiring television movies, biographies, and endless tabloid coverage. But behind that image stood a network of enforcers and traffickers whose lives lacked glamour and ended, more often than not, in prison cells or quiet, unremarked deaths. In that sense, Rampino's biography, marked by addiction, long incarceration, and a low-profile exit from the stage, served as a corrective to romanticized visions of mafia life. American popular culture in the late 1990s and 2000s grappled with this duality in its depictions of organized crime. Films and television series such as Goodfellas, and The Sopranos attracted audiences with their frank, sometimes darkly humorous portrayals of mob characters, but also showed the corrosive effects of that life on individuals and families. While these works were not about Rampino specifically, they drew from the same historical backdrop: the rise and decline of the New York Mafia, the heroin epidemic, and the ultimate futility of trying to maintain power and wealth through crime in the face of relentless law enforcement pressure. Within that broader cultural examination, the figure of Tony Roach appeared in footnotes and sidebars rather than center stage, but his story aligned neatly with the themes that historians and filmmakers alike emphasized. He was a product of working-class, post-war New York. He had been seduced and then trapped by the underworld's promise of fast money and a certain kind of status. He had paid heavily for his involvement in heroin trafficking, and he had aged out of relevance as the world changed around him. The later years of his life were complicated by serious health problems. Reports from those who kept track of old Gambino hands indicate that by the time he was back in New York, he was suffering from lung cancer. Decades of cigarettes, a common habit among men of his generation and milieu, combined with the general wear of stress, drug use, and prison life had taken their toll. Cancer treatment in any case can be grueling. For a man in his late 60s or early 70s, with limited financial resources and no stable, long-term employment history outside the criminal underworld, it was especially so. He spent some of this period in medical facilities in and around New York, where staff and fellow patients might have recognized him, if at all, only vaguely from the kind of crime reporting that had once given fleeting mentions to his name. Unlike John Gotti, whose final illness in a federal medical center was widely covered, Anthony Rampino's battle with cancer played out away from cameras. Friends from his past, those still alive and not imprisoned themselves, may have visited. But whatever emotional reckonings or reflections he experienced in those last months remained private. No journalist sat at his bedside to record closing thoughts about his path from East Harlem boy to Gambino associate to aging ex-convict. In 2010, he died in New York, with sources attributing the cause to lung cancer. The notice of his death circulated primarily within a small community of organized crime watchers and law enforcement veterans. Jerry Capesi's Gangland website, which had long chronicled the doings and fates of New York mob figures, noted his passing as the end of another thread in the complex tapestry of the Gotti era. Mainstream newspapers did not devote long obituaries to him. There were no public memorials drawing crowds to Mulberry Street or Queens sidewalks. His burial, like his final years, appears to have been modest and largely out of the public eye. In a sense, the quiet of his death echoed the broader fatting of the world to which he had once belonged. By 2010, the peak years of Cosa Nostra's overt power in New York were decades past. The five families still existed, and law enforcement agencies continued to bring periodic cases against their remaining leaders and associates. But the scale and audacity of the operations that had characterized the 1970s and 1980s, sky-high truck hijackings, billion-dollar construction scams, brazen midtown assassinations, had largely receded. Other criminal enterprises, from international drug cartels to cybercrime syndicates, occupied more and more of the government's attention. For former associates of the Gambino family who survived into old age, this decline was bittersweet. Some, interviewed in retirement or on supervised release, spoke of their pasts with a mix of nostalgia and regret. They described a code that, in their telling, had held neighborhoods together even as it exploited them. Others admitted that the costs, the addiction, the violence, the long prison sentences, the constant fear of betrayal, had outweighed any fleeting sense of power. Rampino left no such formal record of self-assessment, but his trajectory fits squarely into this generational pattern. Early attraction to a tight-knit underworld community, eventual entanglement in the most harmful rackets of his time, and a final chapter defined by illness and the quiet erosion of old loyalties and structures. Law enforcement officials and historians who look back on cases like his see in them not just individual biographies, but also reflections of policy choices and societal conditions. The environment that produced him, a combination of post-war immigration, economic marginalization, lax early enforcement against organized crime, and the explosive growth of the heroin market, was shaped by forces well beyond any one person's control. At the same time, his life underscores how individual decisions, choosing to work with heroin traffickers, agreeing to accompany armed crews, accepting the role of enforcer, can have profound consequences, both for the person making them and for the communities affected by their actions. The federal heroin prosecution that sent him away in the late 1980s remains, in retrospect, a key moment in the broader campaign to dismantle the Gambino family's most harmful activities. By convicting not only prominent figures like Gene Gotti and John Carneglia, but also associates such as Anthony Rampino, prosecutors demonstrated that their reach extended into the rank and file of criminal enterprises. The long sentences handed down in that case served both as specific punishment for those involved and as a general warning to others contemplating similar roles. At the same time, the story of his later years raises questions that continue to animate debates about crime and punishment. What, in practical terms, happens when a man who has spent 20 years in federal prison is released in his late 60s, with limited legitimate work history and serious health problems? How effective are the tools of supervised release in steering such individuals away from old patterns? To what extent does punitive policy address the social and economic roots of the criminality it seeks to deter? While Anthony "Tony" Roach, Rampino's case does not provide simple answers, it highlights the human complexities that underlie statistics and legal doctrines. By the time of his death, the boy from East Harlem who had once watched older men command deference on the sidewalk, the gaunt associate who had haunted the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club, the heroin user whose nickname captured both his physical state and his persistence, had become a largely forgotten figure outside specialist circles. Yet his life continued to function in law enforcement training materials, in academic studies, and in the footnotes of true crime history, as an illustrative thread in the story of how New York confronted organized crime and the drug epidemics of the late 20th century. That dual existence, obscure in the general public's memory, enduring among those who study the era, speaks to the way history often treats figures like Rampino. They are not the headline names that define a generation, but they are indispensable to understanding how that generation actually lived and how its conflicts played out. Without the Anthony Rampinos of the world, there would have been no need for the massive federal cases, no justification for the sweeping RICO prosecutions, and no concrete examples of how the intersection of organized crime and narcotics devastated communities. In the years since his passing, new waves of crime and new policy challenges have emerged, from the opioid crisis of prescription painkillers and synthetic drugs to debates over mass incarceration and criminal justice reform. Yet when historians trace the lineage of these issues, they often find themselves looking back to the period in which Rampino lived and operated, a time when heroin first flooded American cities on a large scale, when organized crime provided channels for its distribution, and when the government responded with unprecedented investigative tools and severe penalties. His life, as much as any single biography can, encapsulates that era's tangled web of cause and effect, choice and consequence. When Anthony "Tony" Roach, Rampino walked out of federal custody after serving the bulk of his heroin trafficking sentence, he stepped into a New York that barely resembled the city he had left. The exact date of his release is not consistently reported in open sources, but it fell after a stretch of roughly 2 decades behind bars. By then he was an older man in his late 60s, his body worn by age, years of drug use, and the hard conditions of institutional life. The underworld he had known, tight neighborhood enclaves, crowded social clubs, a clear chain of command radiating from figures like Carmine Fatico and John Gotti, had been fractured by prosecutions, betrayals, and changing economic realities. Even in Queens, where the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club had once stood at the center of his existence, the signals were clear. The club had fallen silent years earlier, its role as a power base erased by raids, trials, and the deaths or incarcerations of those who had given it meaning. The Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, Gotti's later headquarters, had been shuttered after the FBI's microphone operation helped send the boss to prison for life. The very spaces that had been stages for the height of the Gotti era now appeared in news photographs as cautionary symbols of a vanished world. By the time Rampino re-entered civilian life, much of the older generation of Gambino figures he had once orbited was gone. Paul Castellano, murdered outside Sparks, had become a reference point in books and documentaries about mafia history. Neil Delacroce, whom Gotti had admired, and to whom Rampino owed his factional allegiance, had died in 1985. Angelo Ruggiero had succumbed to cancer in 1989. John Gotti, once the swaggering Dapper Don, had died of cancer in 2002 in a federal medical facility, his last years marked by pain and isolation. The cohort of men with whom Rampino had hustled in Queens card rooms and back alleys in the 1970s had been reduced, by attrition and long sentences, to a handful of surviving names. For his part, open source reporting indicates that Rampino did not attempt to reclaim any prominent role in organized crime after his release. Crime journalists who followed his career later described him living quietly in New York City, far from the flashbulbs that had once illuminated Gotti's court appearances. He was no longer the wiry enforcer lingering outside the Burgeon Club, but an aging ex-convict whose health problems were serious and visible. Years of heroin abuse and heavy smoking had left their mark. Sources familiar with his last period of life have noted that he was battling cancer and respiratory illness, dependent on disability payments and occasional help from old acquaintances. That diminished final chapter stands in stark contrast to the fear his name once carried in certain circles. In the 1970s and early 1980s, detectives and federal agents had described him as a dangerous presence, a man armed not only with weapons and a willingness to threaten, but with the social capital that came from being close to the Gotti crew. Patrons and employees of bars in Ozone Park and surrounding neighborhoods learned to recognize him as someone whose arrival might signal trouble. Yet after 2 decades in prison and the collapse of the regime he had served, he returned to a city where his notoriety held little practical currency. For New Yorkers in general, his re-entry barely registered. The public's appetite for mob news, once voracious, had shifted to other stories. The September 11 attacks and their aftermath, changes in city leadership, debates over policing, and the rise of new forms of organized criminal activity, identity theft, cyber fraud, and international trafficking run by non-mafia networks, drew attention away from the traditional Italian-American underworld. Younger residents of East Harlem and Queens, many from immigrant backgrounds far removed from Italy, would have recognized the name Tony Roach only if they happened to read specialized crime reporting or watch documentaries about the Gotti years. Yet within law enforcement circles and among historians of organized crime, he remained a familiar figure, a secondary but telling character in the story of how New York's mafia rose, diversified into narcotics, and then suffered debilitating blows from RICO prosecutions. His name appears repeatedly in federal documents, trial transcripts, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses like Salvatore Gravano. In those records, the arc of his life is preserved in a dry, bureaucratic form. Dates of surveillance sightings, summaries of his role in heroin transactions, notes on his presence in backup teams during the Castellano killing, sentencing sheets that convert his actions into years of imprisonment. These documents do not dwell on personality, but patterns emerge. They show a man who, from early adulthood onward, stayed close to the same tight circle of associates, rarely stepping outside the Gambino orbit even as that world proved increasingly dangerous. They show an individual whose long-term drug addiction made him at once an exploiter and a victim of the narcotics economy. They show, finally, how the federal government's evolving strategies, wiretaps, RICO, harsh sentencing, turned someone the mafia might once have regarded as expendable muscle into a crucial link in a chain of evidence leading all the way up to the boss. In late 2010, according to crime reporters who later reconstructed his biography, Anthony "Tony" Rampino died in New York City at the age of 71. Accounts attribute his death to cancer, likely exacerbated by a lifetime of smoking and substance use. There were no front-page obituaries, no formal statements from law enforcement agencies, no large public funerals attended by a who's who of organized crime. To the broader city, his passing was one more entry in the vital records, another older man succumbing to disease after a hard life. Those who did take note were primarily specialists, reporters who had followed the Gotti saga for decades, former investigators who remembered the tapes and surveillance, operations of the 1980s, and perhaps a small number of surviving contemporaries from the shrinking Gotti circle. In columns and retrospectives, he was often described in a few shorthand phrases: a Gambino associate, a heroin-tainted enforcer, a backup man in the Castellano hit, a symbol of the way addiction and organized crime fed off each other to destructive effect. The contrast between that muted ending and the intense, if indirect, role he had played in some of the most dramatic episodes in mafia history highlights a recurring theme in the study of organized crime. The gap between how central a figure may feel during his active years and how marginal he appears when historians and prosecutors reconstruct the larger patterns. In the 1970s and early 1980s, when Rampino was moving heroin through Queens, intimidating debtors and waiting in a backup car outside Sparks, he was operating inside a dense web of relationships, loyalties, and conflicts. Within that web, each action carried immediate, sometimes high-stakes consequences. Defying an order, showing disrespect at a club, mishandling money, all could result in violent retaliation. But from a distance of decades, when scholars, journalists, and law enforcement veterans trace the arcs of these organizations, the focus naturally shifts upward, on bosses, underbosses, consigliere, and influential captains. Figures like Rampino, associates, drivers, collectors, narcotics handlers, are more numerous and, in a sense, more interchangeable. They appear in the historical record as representatives of a type, the rank-and-file mobster whose life embodies both the attraction and the corrosive reality of underworld membership. In that sense, his story provides a useful lens for examining the broader forces that shaped mid to late 20th century New York. His early years in East Harlem coincided with the last phase of dense Italian-American settlement there, a period when tight-knit communities could provide both support and suffocating limits. The lack of economic opportunity beyond low-wage labor, the visibility of neighborhood toughs who seemed to have money and influence, and the thin line between informal social control and outright criminality all created conditions in which young men could be pulled toward the mafia orbit. His move to Queens mapped onto the city's demographic and geographic shifts, white ethnic families trading Manhattan tenements for borough houses, bringing with them not only their ambitions but their existing criminal structures. The Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club embodied that transition, an outwardly ordinary storefront in a suburban setting that housed the operations of a powerful criminal crew. Rampino's immersion in that environment, his addiction to the very drugs his associates sold, and his eventual role in supporting a bold internal coup all flowed from that urban evolution. At the same time, his life illustrates the growing reach and sophistication of law enforcement across those same decades. In the 1950s and early 1960s, when he was first drifting into low-level crime, the American government's understanding of Cosa Nostra was rudimentary. Mafia families were often treated as loose gangs. Investigations were fragmented, focused on individual offenses rather than organizational structure. By the time he was arrested and indicted in the 1980s, that had changed dramatically. RICO allowed prosecutors to treat the Gambino family as a continuing criminal enterprise. The DEA and FBI had learned to follow money, wiretap communications, and persuade insiders to testify. Rampino's conviction for heroin trafficking was inconceivable under the legal and investigative framework of his youth. It required the full apparatus of the modern war on drugs. This convergence of personal and institutional trajectories produced a harsh outcome. His addiction, his willingness to serve as an enforcer for dealers, and the federal government's determination to send a message about heroin combined to yield a sentence that kept him in prison until long past the peak years of his physical and social life. When he emerged, it was into a world where the networks that had shaped his identity were largely dismantled, replaced by new forms of illegality and new law enforcement priorities. It is also important to situate his story within the wider human costs of the drug trade. The heroin networks that ran through Queens and other boroughs in the 1970s and 1980s did not exist in a vacuum. They were part of a complex web of demand and supply that involved international cartels, corrupt officials, and desperate users. In neighborhoods like East Harlem, the arrival of cheap, potent heroin in the 1960s and 1970s coincided with industrial decline and cuts in social services. The result was a wave of addiction, family breakdown, and street crime that left deep scars. Men like Rampino, who operated at the distribution and enforcement level, were essential cogs in that destructive machinery. To law enforcement and to many community members, his conviction and long sentence were a form of accountability, not only for specific transactions, but for participation in a system that profited from widespread suffering. To others, including critics of harsh drug policies, his case also reflected the blunt instrument of conspiracy law, which could impose decades-long penalties even on figures who were not organizational leaders. That tension between a desire for justice and concerns about proportionality remains part of the larger debate over how best to respond to organized criminal involvement in narcotics. After his death in 2010, Anthony "Tony" Roach Rampino became, effectively, a figure fixed in time. He appears in histories of the Gotti era as a known associate, an addict enforcer, a backup presence at one of the signature mob events of the 20th century. He surfaces in books and long-form articles as a reminder that beneath the notorious bosses and celebrated turncoats were dozens, even hundreds, of men whose lives followed a similar pattern. Early exposure to the underworld, incremental involvement in crime, deepening addiction, eventual prosecution, and years of incarceration. In that sense, his life story is less about individual notoriety than about what it reveals of a particular historical moment. It traces the trajectory of a certain kind of New Yorker born in the late 1930s, coming of age in tough ethnic neighborhoods, seduced by the immediate rewards of proximity to mob power, ensnared by the heroin economy, and ultimately overwhelmed by the combined forces of addiction, law enforcement, and organizational collapse. It shows in concrete terms how the abstract concepts historians often invoke, urban decline, organized crime, narcotics policy, mass incarceration, played out in one human life. When the cameras gathered outside the federal courthouse in 1992 to record John Gotti's final walk into the justice system he could no longer evade, they were capturing the climax of a story in which Anthony Rampino had been a constant, if largely unseen, supporting actor. His own end, quiet and largely unremarked, underscores how completely that story had run its course. The world that produced him had passed. What remained was the record: arrest sheets, indictment numbers, transcripts of conversations he did not know were being recorded. And for those willing to look closely, a sobering illustration of the cost of choosing a path that seemed, in the narrow confines of East Harlem and Queens decades earlier, to offer a way out of ordinary hardship and into a different kind of power, one that turned out, in the end, to be both brittle and ruinous. When the news of Anthony "Tony" Rampino's death began to circulate among the small circle of reporters and former investigators who still tracked the remnants of the Gotti era, there were no sirens, no crowds, no live shots from courthouse steps. He died in 2010 at 71, largely out of public view, an aging ex-convict in a city that had moved on. Yet his passing offered a natural point of closure, a moment to look back not only at the arc of one life, but at the world that had produced it and the forces that had finally ground it down. To grasp the full meaning of that arc, it helps to step again into the physical spaces that shaped him. In East Harlem, the tenement streets where he ran as a boy are still there, but their social landscape has been remade. The Italian grocery stores and barbershops that once lined 1st and 2nd Avenue have mostly given way to Dominican and Mexican restaurants, bodegas, and chain pharmacies. Church fairs that once doubled as informal neighborhood reunions for Southern Italian families now draw a congregation with roots scattered across Latin America and the Caribbean. A few holdouts, an old bakery, a social club with faded signage, offer faint echoes of the time when a boy from the Rampino family could walk a few blocks and see men who embodied, in his young eyes, a rough sort of neighborhood power. In Queens, the transformation is just as pronounced. The Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club on 101st Avenue, once the busy nerve center of John Gotti's Queens crew, has long since been closed. For years after the last raid, photographers made pilgrimages there, capturing images of its metal grate pulled down over the door, the faded lettering barely visible. Eventually, even that trace of its identity disappeared as the space was repurposed. Today, passers-by might see a different business altogether in the same storefront, unaware that it once housed the conversations and decisions that drew men like Rampino into criminal conspiracies of national importance. These altered streetscapes underscore a simple point. The social worlds that give rise to figures like Tony are not fixed. They are historical constructions, shaped by migration, economic opportunity, policing practices, and cultural norms. In the decades since his youth, working-class Italian-American families have continued their long, uneven process of upward mobility, moving to the suburbs, entering white-collar professions, intermarrying, and in most cases, leaving the old neighborhood patterns behind. The mafia, once deeply embedded in those neighborhood structures, has been eroded by that very process. As new generations find other paths, the tight feeder networks that once supplied young lookouts, drivers, and enforcers begin to fray. For historians and criminologists, Rampino's life has become one of many case studies in that broader story. His name appears in federal indictments, in the testimony of Salvatore Gravano, and in law enforcement reports that catalog the heroin distribution networks of the 1970s and 1980s. In academic literature on organized crime, those documents are often mined not for the individual drama they represent, but for the patterns they reveal. How crews are structured, how they manage risk, how they recruit and discipline associates, how they respond to pressure from investigations. In that analytical frame, Tony is less a singular character than a representative figure. He illustrates how mid-level participants sustain a criminal organization day to day, collecting debts, moving drugs, standing guard, projecting menace. He shows how addiction can exist not just among a criminal network's victims, but within its own ranks, eroding discipline even as it deepens involvement. And he demonstrates how, Once law enforcement develops the tools to connect those mid-level acts to a larger enterprise, the men in his position find themselves facing the kind of long, structured federal sentences once reserved mostly for syndicate leaders. Those tools, especially RICO and advanced electronic surveillance, are central to any assessment of Rampino's era. When he was a boy in East Harlem, the FBI did not even publicly acknowledge the existence of Cosa Nostra. By the time agents were writing Tony Roach in surveillance logs, that posture had changed. The Appalachian meeting in 1957 and the Valachi testimony in the early 1960s had dragged the mafia into the national spotlight. Over the next 2 decades, prosecutors and legislators crafted legal strategies designed not merely to punish isolated crimes, but to dismantle entire organizations. RICO allowed them to charge patterns of racketeering, hold bosses responsible for the acts of subordinates, and seek forfeiture of assets. The heroin cases in which Rampino figured were a textbook application of that approach. In older legal frameworks, the government might have arrested him with a small amount of narcotics and pursued a limited charge that carried, at most, a few years in prison. Under the conspiracy models embraced in the 1980s, tapes of him being discussed on the phone, surveillance placing him at key locations, and testimony about his role in moving drugs could be knitted together into a picture of sustained participation in a larger trafficking enterprise. That shift is what transformed him from a local drug dealer into a federal defendant looking at decades in custody. Critics of the war on drugs have pointed out with some justification that such conspiracy cases sometimes swept up peripheral actors, users, girlfriends, distant relatives, who had only tangential contact with drugs. But in Rampino's case, the record portrays something different. His involvement was neither fleeting nor accidental. As Gravano and others made clear, he was a regular participant in heroin distribution for the Gotti Ruggiero crew, someone whose own addiction was inseparable from the supply networks feeding New York's street market. For communities ravaged by overdoses and drug-related violence in those years, men like him were not abstract villains, but proximate sources of danger. That recognition helps explain the near-total lack of romanticism in most serious accounts of his life. Popular culture has often portrayed the mafia through a glossy or stylized lens. Films like The Godfather and television series like The Sopranos, while critical and nuanced, inevitably contribute to a certain mythologizing of mob figures. The codes of honor, the family dinners, the air of tragic inevitability. Even a harder-edged film like Goodfellas, which focuses on mid-level hoodlums rather than bosses, carries an undeniable cinematic charge. Rampino's story, by contrast, contains few of those cinematic elements. There are no grand speeches, no carefully choreographed ceremonies, no artfully lit family gatherings. Instead, there are dingy clubhouses, chemical dependency, back-of-the-car conversations about drugs and debt, and long stretches of institutional time. The closest he comes to appearing in a movie scene is his presence in a backup car near Sparks Steakhouse on the night Paul Castellano was killed. And even there, his role is as an unseen insurance policy, not as a central actor. When documentaries and books recount that night, their focus naturally falls on Castellano, Bilotti, the shooters, and John Gotti's alleged vantage point. Tony Roach exists in the margins, important within the operational logic of the crew, but almost invisible in the narrative frame. That marginality is not unique to him. It is characteristic of the dozens of associates whose lives formed the ground-level reality of the mafia, but whose names were never widely known outside their neighborhoods. In some ways, they inhabit the most revealing layer of the story. Bosses and underbosses made the strategic decisions that brought the Gambino family into conflict with the state. But it was the daily actions of associates like Rampino, selling heroin, enforcing debts, carrying out surveillance, that translated those decisions into social impact. the spread of addiction in East Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens, the fear that kept some residents from reporting extortion, the sense, in certain blocks, that illegal power structures rivaled or exceeded official ones. All of that depended on the presence of men at his level. Law enforcement officers who worked the cases of the 1980s and 1990s were acutely aware of that dynamic. Many have spoken, in interviews and memoirs, about the ambivalence they felt toward mob prosecutions. On one hand, they were determined to break the mafia's grip on unions, construction, and local businesses, and to tackle the heroin trade in particular. On the other, they sometimes encountered associates whose life stories elicited a grim kind of sympathy. Kids from poor backgrounds, limited schooling, early exposure to crime, few visible paths upward. Rampino, with his East Harlem origins and his lifelong battle with addiction, fits that profile. Yet those same officers would be quick to add that sympathy does not erase responsibility. Choice played a role at every step. The choice to attach himself to the Burgeon crew instead of seeking out low wage. Legitimate work. The choice to continue in heroin distribution even as its destructive effects became obvious. The choice to remain loyal to the Gotti faction even when it was plunging ahead with actions, like the Castellano killing, that dramatically increased the risk of massive legal consequences. In interviews about the heroin cases, former prosecutors have emphasized that without consistent participation by men like Rampino, the grand strategies of mafia leaders could not have been implemented on the street. The broader historical record bears out the impact of the crackdown that eventually swept him up. By the 2010s, when he died, New York's Italian-American mafia families were still present but vastly diminished in reach. Decades of RICO prosecutions, the steady stream of cooperators, and the erosion of their traditional working-class base had taken a toll. Racketeering still occurred in certain sectors, waste management, some construction, some gambling, but it no longer exhibited the brazen visibility of the Gotti heyday. Journalists writing about the enduring mafia in New York now focus on smaller-scale operations, often overshadowed by newer, more globalized criminal networks. In that downsized landscape, the role once played by men like Rampino has changed as well. The archetype of the street-tough Italian-American associate, haunting the sidewalk outside a club in Queens or Brooklyn, is less common. Other ethnic and national groups have filled the space once dominated by the five families, particularly in drug trafficking. At the same time, law enforcement has adapted some of the same tools honed against the mafia: wiretaps, long conspiracy indictments, aggressive use of cooperating witnesses, to pursue gangs, cartels, and white-collar criminal schemes. One area where his story retains contemporary relevance is in debates over drug policy, sentencing, and rehabilitation. As scholars and policymakers reassess the outcomes of the war on drugs, they often point to the 1980s as a critical decade. Harsh mandatory minimums, massive prison expansion, and an enforcement emphasis that disproportionately affected certain communities. Cases like Rampino's exist at the intersection of these debates. On one level, his lengthy sentence exemplifies the era's severity: decades in prison for involvement in a heroin network. On another, the record of his sustained participation and the scale of the conspiracy he joined place him closer to the serious trafficker category that even many reformers agree warrants substantial punishment. The question then becomes not whether men like him should have faced serious legal consequences. They almost certainly should, but how societies might, earlier in the life cycle of such individuals, interrupt the pathways that lead from street corner delinquency to entrenched organized crime. In Rampino's case, those pathways included early exposure to neighborhood toughs, limited legitimate economic prospects, and the ready availability of heroin in a milieu where the social stigma against dealing it was weak or selectively enforced. As cities and countries grapple with new waves of substance abuse crises, whether involving opioids, synthetic drugs, or other substances. The lessons from that earlier era, embodied in lives like his, carry ongoing weight. Memory, too, plays a role in shaping how these lessons are absorbed. In popular imagination, the Gotti years are sometimes reduced to a set of striking images: the boss in tailored suits, the throngs outside the courthouse, the midtown hit at Sparks, the final perp walk into federal custody. Anthony "Tony" Rampino appears in none of those photographs. Yet if one were to zoom out from any of those scenes, to include the anonymous figures on the periphery, the men in unremarkable jackets smoking near the curb, the names in small type in the indictment, his outline would be there. A documentary that tries to tell his story, as this narrative has attempted to do, necessarily shifts the lens away from the bright center of the frame toward that periphery. It asks viewers to consider what it meant to live, over the course of 7 decades, as a small but real part of a system that inflicted significant harm on its surroundings, and then to confront the personal costs of that involvement: addiction, long imprisonment, illness, and in the end, a quiet, unmourned exit from the world he had once navigated with purpose. There is, finally, a kind of historical irony in how his life intersected with the larger story of American organized crime. The generation of mob figures that preceded him, men like Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, operated in an era when law enforcement was fragmented and legal tools were limited. The generation that followed, raised amid the wreckage of RICO prosecutions and constant surveillance, grew up in a world where the old neighborhood clubhouses were more museum pieces than functioning institutions. Rampino belonged to the transitional cohort in between, young enough to surf the wave of expansion that brought the Gambino family into the lucrative heroin trade, old enough to be fully exposed when that same expansion triggered a ferocious legal and political backlash. As the credits begin to roll on his particular chapter of that saga, what remains is less a tale of daring than a stark illustration of cause and effect. Early choices made in the shadow of East Harlem tenements led to a life lived in the orbit of criminal crews. The decision to embrace heroin, first as a user, then as a trafficker, bound him to a destructive economy that drew the attention of an increasingly capable federal apparatus. His willingness to serve as an enforcer and backup man on the most consequential night of the Gotti coup fixed his name permanently in the evidentiary record. And the state's response, prolonged investigation, indictment, conviction, and decades of incarceration, ensured that his final years would be spent far from the streets that had once defined him. In the end, Anthony "Tony" Rampino is not a figure to be admired or reviled in isolation, but one to be understood as part of the dense human fabric of a particular time and place. His life story, traced from post-war immigrant New York through the height and decline of the mafia, offers a sobering window into how individual agency and structural forces intertwine, how the search for status and quick money can lead, step by incremental step, into a trap from which there is rarely any graceful escape.